So after reaching China and witnessing, uncultured and unethical acts and practices of progressive foreign forces, they discovered China to be a country having long history and rich culture like India and an innocent victim of the imperialistic design. One of the most important aspects of their travelogue is thus a strong expression of natural affinity with China. And this is in fact surprising because in the late 19th century, subaltern knowledge about China was very limited. The major source of information about China was colonial press and hearsay from the soldiers and travelers involved with China in their different capacities since the beginning of the opium trade. The spontaneous expression of affinity with the Chinese people was the result of their keen observation and comprehension of the Chinese society and culture. So both the book thus begin on a very sympathetic note and the tenor of which can be perceived throughout the book. Gadadhar Singh, he writes in a more forceful manner. He argues that China escaped fate of India and China. Japan escaped fate of India and China because it took corrective steps to adopt measures to modernize and strengthen its society. In his travelogue, he frequently returns to Japan to demonstrate bravery and commitment of Japanese soldiers and officers to the assigned task as part of the joint expeditionary force. The molding of Asian societies to accommodate energy and dynamism of Western society was essential to rescue this civilization. The problem for him rested more on social inertia and less on lack of political activism. He was as loyal to the British state as to Indian society. Writing his travelogue as an officer of the British Indian state, he thus does not find any contradiction in his support of the state and his commitment to restore the glory of ancient and civilized Indian and Chinese people and society. And this is a very important point that talks about the essential differences between the Indian and Chinese worldview and like a society-centric view in India and a state-centric view in China, and that point could be further explored. So recognizing that the mission of his troop was to fight the Chinese, and there was no question of vacillation as a Rajput from the assigned duty, his heart bled for the Chinese. He found them fellow believers and compatriots who belonged to neighboring Asian regions. Their color, custom and ritual, as well as their religion, Buddhism, matched with Indians. Sentimentally he thus writes, why did the Supreme Being make them suffer so much? Shouldn't they be helped by him? So in the same vein, like he talks about, the civilizational affinity and various things. So in the same vein, Garg also, find that an average Chinese is smarter than anybody in knowledge and skill. They can tell time by looking at the movement of sun. They know all the four directions. They can cook, see, make purchases, rowing, drying water, harnessing various animals in a very efficient manner. Their business skill is so fine that it can never be mastered by the outsider in hundreds of years. Their examination system is the most difficult of the world. Westerners, he notes, are learning Chinese for several years, but none could still answer all the questions in that language. On the other hand, there are hundreds of Chinese doctors, engineers, graduates and postgraduates who have been trained in West and doing very well. So there are Chinese dentists whose knowledge and skill are so high as compared to MDs that many Westerners go only to them for treatment of the complex dental problems. So knowing that Buddhism had come from India, the Chinese, he writes, often call themselves Hindu, but they do not have any caste or Sikh differences as Indians have. Neither do they believe in differentiating human beings as touchable, untouchable. So Then he notes that it's the lack of cultural understanding that leads to violent quarrels between Chinese and foreigners. He gives references that how so many small incidents happen because foreigners fail to understand the cultural beliefs of Chinese and the most importantly, the final point, both Gadadhar Singh and Garg did not find Boxer's ideology preposterous and bizarre. Growing up in Indian milieu, they were familiar with the subaltern belief of mystical or superpower and esoteric rituals connected with ordination in secret society. For him, there was nothing surprising or new in it. Everybody, Gadadhar Singh writes, knows about superpowers of Hazrat Muhammad, Christ and Guru Nanak. The wondrous sword of Guru Gobind Singh was no less miraculous than Boxer's sword. Various stories about Boxer's masters and half-masters, their ability to climb trees, walk on straight walls, ward off bullets by the swift movement of heavy swords, perform stupendous tasks and make their bodies impregnable and indestructible by chanting mantra were probable and plausible for him. And to support his views, he quotes from Robert Hart, N.P. Chamberlain, and an unnamed priest who have seen boxers doing these things. So Garg's description of Boxer also had the same perception, and he writes that the situation of Indian disciples of the goddess performing various incredible acts and who do not feel pain by repeatedly hitting themselves by iron chains. And he writes that trouble was inevitable when Catholic missionaries arrived at the Boxer's land of Shantung. They tried to change, the feng shui and all those things, and that led to people getting angry over foreigners and leading to anti-foreign movement in China. So it would something. So it would not be an exaggeration to suggest that voluntaristic expressions evincing cultural and brotherly affinities dominate modern Indian perception of China and overrides colonial states' agenda and Westerners' derisive and contemptuous description of Boxer China. Gadadhar Singh writes that who does not know that both India and China are two largest and most fertile countries in Asian region. Civilizationally too, both are the best. The oldest book in the world is Veda. Aryans were first to receive the Vedic education, and that is reason for the Aryavat country's reputation as teacher of the world. Similarly, China is also an extremely ancient country, with chronologically recorded history from 25,000 BC, and it has always been independent and under its own country. So in view of such a situation, China would have been very developed now, but the reality is different and China has touched the lowest ebb. So looking at Singh and Garg's travelogue, one does not find so much condemnation of foreign rule. They were the British subject, they were not as lamentation at the loss of China's social and cultural vigor. They concentrated more on the loss of it. They are less concerned about the possibility of the foreign or British takeover of China. In fact, they do not see it as an obstacle in facilitating social change, leading to restoration of the purified Chinese essence and reinvigoration of its society. So thus strengthened, both China and India possess essential cultural or civilizational similarities to unitedly become a leading world power. So it may be noted that like when we see the Chinese description of India of the same time, They also, narrated, scoff, at India being inert, immobile, and dead, and thus incapable of rising to its past glory or to a modern state, like Wu Guangfei, who visited, India in 1901. He said that India was ruined because its people were insensitive with no pretensions to mechanical skills and were living in a barren open country, in a small villages, totally cut off from the world. Hence one morning the other race arrived through the sea route, frightened Buddhism to make it extinct and adjudicated local people as serfs, the weak as prey of the strong, and that certainly was the cause of ruin of India. It is said that the country is sinking into mourning and is still living more or less undisturbed and peaceful, uh, as if nothing has happened. This is not only not mourning, but also disgraceful. So his advice to Chinese state was that we must learn from the fate of India and would not let foreigners take similar advantages to in China. So that totally, diametrically, totally opposite view. Both, we're talking about, inertia and loss of vigor, but one was, not so against the British rule. The other was, that, we should. We have our heroes, Wu Kuang writes, we have our heroes, and we should not indulge in lofty talks about love and justice, but investigate the matter more closely. There is no doubt that contemporary India did not inspire confidence. It preferred state activism as compared to the social activism referred to in Indian description. So while both Indian and Chinese images of each other as evinced in the travelogue did not differ much as far as their contemporary conditions were concerned, they advocated divergent methods to restore their land to earlier glories. This divergence may be the result of historically different trajectories of their evolution, which defined state-society relationships and molded their respective worldviews. In India, as Suripto Kaviraj has noted, the central idea of political theory is that social order is not subordinate to the king's legislative function. Rather, he is subordinate to transcendent divine order as well as the social order. And further, the rules of the caste order as a system of social relations are thus impervious to the constant fluctuation of royal power. So as long as the Brahminical power has not been disturbed, Indians were not concerned about political changes. Because in the most of the Chinese writing on India, the first question is how did Indians participate in the British army? How could they allow British to control India? And I think this addresses the question that the Indian system was more based on maintaining or preserving the social order. So this he writes seems to explain an unusual feature of Indian history, the general absence of political rebellion against political rulers, similar to slave or peasant rebellions of ancient or medieval Europe. By contrast, the major upheavals of Indian social history were directed against the supposedly transcendent order and its primary intellectual custodians and mediators, the Brahminical intelligentsia. In contrast, China's historical experiences promoted state-centric forces, bringing about a unity between the state and society over a uniform political ideology, which ultimately shaped the Chinese worldview. So these travelers, looking at each other from different prisms, suggested different route to modernity. They were, however, sure about the civilizational linkages between the two and aspired their people to work unitedly for the upliftment of their society. So this is in short, it's, what happened. Actually, we often ignore, the historical legacies and the worldview, and when we talk about, the Chinese impression. Why did, like the question appear, why did, like how was India viewed by Chinese? And there were many, kind of linkages. One was cultural linkages, where there was brotherly, relation, Shanghai and all of that. They talked about, but in terms of political, thing, the matter was totally different. All the Chinese intellectuals from during the May 4th period and after that, they thought that India is not a country which could prove to be an important or good example. It was considered a lost country. India, Poland and Turkey, they were considered as lost countries and not a model which could be used in bringing about modernity of China. So the linkages existed, but they were at different level. They were different kind of linkages. So the writing of these say subaltern Indians say that because of the ritual, because of the culture, they felt some kind of affinity toward China. But political India was very different.
Thank you very much. I think that opens up a whole new set of kind of questions. So let's get to the discussion. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Is this coming across?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Sheel. A fascinating subject, particularly to a former soldier. I have one question and a few quick comments. The question is, I didn't quite catch whether Pandit Mahendru Lal Garg's that the Chinese view of India as a lost country, as a decadent or backward country, unable to resist the British capture of the country and not interested in the political order or changing the political order once the British had taken it. I should think it should be viewed also in the context that India was a number of different states, and even now today we are fairly close to being a United States of Europe, which does not exist. And in 1901 it would have been even more so. But nevertheless, the essential difference would be, which your Chinese writers perhaps did not consider, was that they had a central government which, because it was weak and ineffective, allowed the Western navigating countries to establish large pockets of control on their coasts. I mean, and the Boxer Rebellion, etc., were outcomes of a large number of these things. All of you know of that. And the Chinese were powerless to resist. The Chinese of the time were powerless to resist these occupations. On the other hand, in India, there was a continuous series of resistance, starting from 1757. It is another matter that most of them failed, but we are not going into Indian history at this point. But the point is that there was resistance. Palasi, Oudh, Buxa, and all the way up to the Punjab, and primarily the Marathas, and even right down to Kerala, which was towards the end. So there was continuous resistance all the way by the various Indian states. So I think that needs to be factored into any conclusion. The Chinese central system had become weak and ineffective. We did not have a central system. We were a number of independent kingdoms and so on, but yet each resisted. That they lost is another matter. The second comment is from the military point of view, or rather the military history point of view. You talk about the 7th Rajput Regiment. I mean, if you're going to develop this into a little more, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Rajput Regiment, in fact, this numbering system came up in 1922, so it's post all that. And I must mention that they were not native regiments of the British Army, they were native regiments of the Indian Army. The British Army being a separate entity by itself, which also operated in India. So, I mean, the use of that term is historically incorrect. It wasn't native regiments of the British Army, they were native regiments of the Indian Army, which was officered and controlled by the British, of course. Now the 7th Rajputs, the battalion which was there, to the best of my knowledge, is the 1st Battalion, 7th Rajputs. And it is today 4th Battalion, the Brigade of the Guards of our country. And if you want to expand this further, there is a lot of detail on the actions of the battalion in the Boxer War and so on, in the history of both the Rajput Regiment and the Brigade of Guards. So maybe you might want to incorporate what already exists in writing in addition to what the Sultan Major of the battalion wrote. And you might want to look at that aspect of it in case you wish to take this further into a film, because there is a lot of writing, admittedly by the British officers. This is a case of it being written in Hindi by the Sultan Major, and also by the doctor. Now, and last is another small question: is the doctor, in those days, the only Indians being given commissions were the Indian Medical Service. It's not clear from what we heard just now whether he had become a sort of a assistant doctor, not a full-fledged doctor, or had he actually done an examination and got commissioned as an officer of the Indian Medical Service, which was a British service but had Indians. They were the first officers of ethnic Indians to become officers of the Indian Army. So perhaps that might you might like to. And lastly, this the point you made that Thakur Gadadhar Singh, Sultan Major Gadadhar Singh of 1st Battalion, 7th Rajputs, as I see it, found no dichotomy between supporting British imperialism, as some might like to call it, and sympathizing with Indian nationalism. It was a big issue, but it was a big issue right up to the Second World War. My own father was in the Indian Army at the time, and he found no dichotomy between being an honest Indian and fighting Britain's wars in Southeast Asia. And he refused to go to the army when he was personally asked by somebody from his own college, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. He says, no, my duty lies to the army I've sworn an oath to. So I don't see that as strange, because lots of Indians felt the same way. Thank you very much.
Let's get
Other members of that whole contingent was Ganga Singh, who went on to become the Maharaja of Bikaner, and the Ganga Rasaila contributed a squadron to that. Maybe in the Bikaner archives of the former state of Bikaner, you might find some material on what Ganga Singh observed, because you know Ganga Singh went on to become the Chancellor of the Chamber of Princes and held was one of the most prominent of the former rulers of India. The second point I have is that nobody has mentioned, and I think this issue has not received very much attention, namely the impact in India of Japan's aggression against China. Perhaps Madhuri, in her book, the book that she edited along with others, 3 others, has something on this. I'm interested to know, did Panditji, for example, speak out against Japan's aggression, or Japan's continual series of aggressions against China? Did this enter the Indian political awareness, so to speak, just as the independence movement was very aware of what went on in the Western theatre, in the rise of Nazism, etc. Something maybe you could comment on. And third and last, I want to gently suggest to Professor Isabella Jackson that perhaps for an Indian the term sub-imperialism to describe the role of the Sikhs, etc., is a little inappropriate, because we were not beneficiaries of that imperialism. We were in fact captives of that imperialism, and we were forced-marched into ventures like the putting down of the Boxer Rebellion. So, as an Indian, I find the term sub-imperialism rather offensive, if you permit me to say that. Thank you.
there was a question. Yeah.
To Ms. Jackson, because I'm not very sure how you situate India in the category of sub-imperialist power, because I think you're dealing specifically with 19th and 20th, early 20th century presence, Indian presence in China. And to elaborate that further, if my memory serves me correct, sub-imperialism is essentially ontologically coming from Marxist interpretation of imperialism, and categories like super-imperialism or ultra-imperialism, which were used erroneously in their original context, gave genesis to this sub-imperialist category. And in that sense, I'm not sure how power relationship between India and China at that particular time can actually be referred to as an imperialist sort of power play, because even in your presentation, I couldn't really understand the presence of Sikh in terms of their influence on economy or military or strategy of China at that point of time. So it would be really interesting if you were trying to sort of redefine the category of sub-imperialism in this context. And if you do so, how exactly do you, I mean, are you altering the basic variable of power in that sense? Are you altering the basic variable of power in terms of, you know, because I find that in the original context, power is what is being measured in terms of an imperialist country vis-a-vis the others. So how exactly do you explain that in your paper? Thank you.
In your material, your primary literature, did you come across any discussion on why Punjab regiment was selected over, let's say, a Gorkha regiment?
Can you add some more light on
Pretty soon we need to get your responses. Perhaps we should get some responses and then go back to questions. Okay, which one of you would like to go first?
Okay, well, you know, your question, found in a archival, you know, document published by, archives, the expedition of British forces during 1870 to that. So there they have used, you know, this term, 7th, you know, Rajput. So using, you know, that, I use that. And then, yeah, I fully agree with you that, you know, like in India, you know, the question of serving, you know, in the British force and maintaining, you know, the social and cultural norm was, you know, quite normal. You know, it was not something, you know, which would have bothered, you know, Gadadhar Singh or Mahendru Garg, because like before, like during the Mughal period also, you know, you had, you know, this system. So it is, you know, like for Chinese, you know, it was something, you know, very strict. Like Wang Hongwu, you know, he gave, you know, much lecture, and the important question was, you know, Ghalib wrote, you know, that we should now, you know, follow the British, like when Sayyid Ahmad Khan, you know, was establishing, you know, follow the British, you know, system, and he questioned that how could, you know, Indians write that, and also how could Indians be part of the British force? Like that, you know, no Chinese Mandarin could ever think of doing. So that is, you know, something, you know, different in the Chinese, you know, world. You know, being, you know, I think we have to think in terms of society-centric and state-centric. You know. Like, you know, a Falun Gong or any, you know, movement in China could become a national crisis. Not so much in India, because you had, you know, so many, you know, movements simultaneously going on, and we are, you know, like very tuned with, you know, pluralistic, you know, system, and China being, you know, a uniform ideology. And historically, you know, when you see that China, you know, dynastic changes in China were always, you know, through secret societies. You know, the movement in China were always, you know, secret societies, where you don't find so much, you know, role of secret societies in India in bringing about, you know, political changes. Because anything, you know, against the centralized ideology becomes heretical. And if you are doing, you know, following some heresy, you have to do it secretly. So there's a basic difference between the worldviews of, you know, India and China, and that should be, you know, kept in mind. And actually, like This has been remarked by Phillips, who was director of SOAS. He wrote, a very good article in 1950 about India and China, the essential difference. I just, read it, some quotation and from him. Professor Phillips noted, different patterns of massive political upsets and changes to uncommon nature of state society dynamics. He argued that in spite of the massive communist revolution in China, bringing about revolutionary socio-economic changes, the changes there followed an established pattern. It was, however, India which negotiated a difficult path, unparalleled to their historical past. The political change in China has many parallels in its long history that witnessed rebellions and war preceding a political change. As far as India was concerned, there was no such historical example available. Unlike China, what happened there was a different kind of political movement that enveloped the whole country, guided by the experience of past century and not the 2,000-year-old history. In this sense, the Indian path to freedom was perhaps more remarkable and more revolutionary. So this is what he is, hinting at, that without, a democratic kind of changes that, Indian